Miracle at Camp Friendship. Chapter 4. Welcome to Camp Friendship. Like a tower of building blocks toppling over, my vision of resort, Camp Friendship crumbled in the dust as the bus screeched to a halt just a short distance off the main road in a clearing, about the size of a baseball field. Tall pines and smaller trees and shrubs totally shut us in. Even the camp sign disappeared from view. In front and to the right of the gravelled clearing, the trees had been cut down. We could see just two buildings. First was a long, narrow building covered with black tar paper. A row of dirty glass windows lined two sides, and a big black chimney stuck up above the sloped roof. A weather-beaten pine shingle dangled from one hook over the door. In scrawled letters it read, "Dining Hall." A big bell with a rope hanging from it hung beside the door. A smaller building, also wrapped in black tar paper, was next to the dining hall. The shingle there was neatly lettered and proudly announced Camp Office. On a narrow porch, an older gentleman and lady, nodding sleepily, sat in two rockers. She had a red shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and he had a camouflage hat pulled down to his ears. Those were their two distinguishing features. Both wore spectacles far down on their noses, and they squinted in our direction as we drove up. The gentleman raised his hand to acknowledge our arrival. Obviously they were expecting us. "Who are they?" questioned Susie, without a minute's hesitation. I suppose she thought the rest of us knew, but Mr. Friendson and Pastor Gentle were the only ones who knew. "That's Aunt Ruth and Uncle Jake," Mr. Friendson said. "They have run this camp for 40 years or more. I came here years ago as a youngster. It was a little different then." "My dad came to this camp too," interjected Acey. "This is where he dedicated his life to the Lord. He said he owes a lot to Aunt Ruth and Uncle Jake and Camp Friendship." "I agree," continued Mr. Friendson, "and one good turn deserves another. That's one reason we're here." I didn't know exactly what he meant, but I was still in shock. "Now," continued Mr. Friendson, "before you get off the bus and take your things to the lodges, I think we should choose buddies. We are in the mountains, far away from town. Most of you are unfamiliar with the wild, and any mistake or accident could have serious consequences. The buddy system will help us keep track of each other." "Miriam's my buddy," Susie piped up, and she grabbed her new friend somewhat roughly by the arm. Miriam got her balance back and smiled sweetly as usual. I've never seen Miriam be anything but sweet-tempered. Not all of us are so good-natured. That left Sandy and Christy to be the other set of girl buddies. I assumed Hapford and Ronnie would be buddies, and probably Acey and Racer. I didn't know whom Reginald would pair up with, maybe J. Michael. They were both intellectuals. It didn't turn out that way though. Acey chose J. Michael. Booker and Racer did a high five to indicate their intentions, and, believe it or not, Ronnie announced that he wanted us to be buddies. Pastor Gentle looked at me and said, "Let Patience have her perfect work." Then he winked. I got the message. God still had some rough edges he had to polish in my character. That left Hapford and Reginald as buddies. How about that? "Come on now," said Mr. Friendson. "Let's go meet Aunt Ruth and Uncle Jake. Do you know what? They hadn't moved since we arrived. They just kept rocking. I saw them later in the dining hall kitchen. They had a little table there. The lines in their faces seemed to say something was troubling them, but I had no idea what. Maybe it's just a natural part of growing older, I thought." Now, none of what I just described went unnoticed. From the cover of the nearby woods, an uninvited guest was watching curiously. Our arrival took him quite by surprise. He shrank back into the shadows. Instinct from years of wearisome survival said, "Stay hidden." Back at the bus, it was time to unload. Since this was not a resort after all, and there were no bellhops, we all proceeded to claim our luggage as Mr. Thriftmore and Mr. Friendson set it out. "Where are the lodges?" asked Booker, looking all around. J. Michael had a question too. We aren't going to have to sleep in tents, are we? No, no, chuckled Mr. Friendson. He pointed off to the left in the direction of some huge pines. That's south, announced Ronnie, proudly pulling his compass out of his pocket again. I was slightly impressed, since he was my buddy. Beyond the pines was a narrow path, thick and layers of pine needles. Just follow the path, said Mr. Friendson. The lodges are at the top of the ridge. Boys to the right, girls to the left, just past the fork in the path. The little buildings you pass just before each lodge are the washrooms. I thought I knew what he meant, but I didn't ask. In the next 10 minutes, I found out I was right. The lodges had no bathrooms, not even cold running water. In comparison to the lodges, the washrooms were quite elegant, and they had cold and hot running water, sometimes. When Dad and I came up here last year, we helped build the washrooms, AC announced. Light was beginning to dawn. AC knew what the rest of us had not known, and, as Pastor Gentle would have said, he kept his lip buttoned. Had we known more precisely what roughing it really meant, we might not have been looking forward to the retreat with so much excitement. While we mustered our strength to carry not only our luggage but also the girls' luggage to the lodges, a shrill blast split the air. It sounded just like a whistle Mr. Friendson blew at school when break time was over. We all stopped dead in our tracks and turned toward it. Mr. Friendson was grinning at us. Good, he said, with the whistle still between his teeth. I wanted to see if it would work. Meet me back here in 45 minutes. We have lots of work to do before the dinner bell. Oh, Miss Content, Mr. Thriftmore, don't forget about the wood. They nodded. A change had taken place in Mr. Friendson. Suddenly he had turned into a drill sergeant. Was there a conspiracy going on here? Since we all had our marching orders, Miss Content led the girls to the Queen Esther's Lodge, and Mr. Thriftmore led us to, get this, David's Hideaway Lodge. When Mr. Thriftmore turned the doorknob at David's Hideaway Lodge, the door squeaked open on rusty hinges. A musty, dusty smell wrinkled our noses as our eyes tried to adjust to the dingy interior. Mr. Thriftmore flipped the light switch. The one large, bare bulb hanging from the rafters gave one quick flash, and then left us in the dinginess. The only other light was coming through dusty windows, all but one of us, which were closed. More light seeped through a slatted opening at the peak of the roof. A pot-bellied stove sat in the centre of the room, and rusty metal old-style bunks lined two walls. A thin mattress lay uninvitingly on each. In the corner were a beat-up broom and dustpan. Some rags hung up beside them on a peg. Some resort, said Ronnie sarcastically. The rest of us were speechless. I'll go get a new light bulb so we can see in here, said Mr. Thriftmore. While I'm gone, you boys carry out the mattresses and beat them a little to get rid of some of the dust. Unroll your sleeping bags and get your beds ready. I should be back by then. That's what we did. The clouds of dust flew up until we were coughing and sneezing. We shook and beat those mattresses for all they were worth. We must have looked pretty silly. It's creepy to think about it now, but again we were being watched from behind some nearby trees. In our wildest dreams we had no idea what was going on. We didn't find out until later. Actually, we had taken someone's bed and chased him out of his temporary shelter. By the time Mr. Thriftmore got back, we had finished making our beds and were looking for window sills or other places to store our toothbrushes, combs, soap, and other necessary sleepover items. Mr. Thriftmore started looking around for something to stand on so he could replace the light bulb, but he continued giving instructions at the same time. Put your suitcases and backpacks under the beds. AC and J. Michael, please open the rest of those windows. That will let a little more light and help us get rid of that musty smell. Hapford and Reginald, it would be helpful if you would get the broom and dustpan and sweep up a bit. What about us, Mr. Thriftmore? Asked Ronnie. This was something new and interesting. Ronnie was asking for a job. Of course, nodded Mr. Thriftmore, pleasantly surprised. You and Pudge may carry in firewood. Stack it there by the stove, he said, pointing to the wood box. I have a feeling it will get pretty chilly tonight, and we'll need plenty of wood. Booker and Racer, come with me. We need to find a stepladder to reach that bulb. Without missing a beat, he added, No fooling around, please. Mr. Franson gave us 45 minutes, and we don't want to be late. We all had our assignments and got right at them. With the windows open, there really was more light, and I suppose our eyes were adjusting to the dinginess also. Suddenly Hapford said, Look, Reginald, birds are roosting on the rafters. We all looked at where Hapford was pointing. Oh no, gasped Reginald, those aren't birds. They are bats. I believe, don't disturb them. But it was too late. Hapford had already taken a swipe at them with the broom. Two of them started swiping wildly around the room. They're going to get in my hair, shouted Ronnie, waving his arms above his head. No, they aren't, insisted Reginald. They have sonar. The bats soon found their roost again. What's going on? Mr. Thriftmore, Booker and Racer were back with the stepladder. We have bats in the rafters, Hapford said. What are we going to do to get rid of them? That is a problem, said Mr. Thriftmore, taking off his cap and scratching his head. See that rusty rod hanging from the opening up there? Pointed out AC. When it gets dark, the bats will fly out through the slats, and we can use the rod to close the slats, so they can't get back in. That's what we did last summer. I guess someone left the slats open, and the bats got back in. All this time, we were still being watched. Our spy had opened the slats to air out the lodge, and he was also the one who had opened the window. It is also strange that a window was left open, said AC. When I was here with Dad, we made sure all the windows were closed before we left. Dad said that was one of the camp rules. When you check out of your lodge, make sure all the windows are closed. At the time, there seemed to be no explanation except that someone had broken the camp rule. Whatever the reason for the open window and the open slats, we were glad AC had some previous camp experience. Camp Friendship was like a different world, and he was our fearless leader. With the bat situation settled, Mr. Thriftmore set about the task of replacing the light bulb. The ladder he found was in pretty bad shape. Racer, may I borrow your super sport to tighten up some of these bolts? Yes, sir, answered Racer enthusiastically. He was glad to find a reason to get it out and show off its special features. At the moment, Ronnie couldn't find any good reason to get out his compass. Mr. Thriftmore did what he could for the ladder, but still asked Booker and J. Michael to steady it while he climbed up to replace the light bulb. When he finished, the room became much brighter. It looked better too, with the beds made up and the floor swept. We had already made an improvement. As Mr. Thriftmore climbed down the ladder, he declared, Mr. Franson will be blowing that whistle any minute now. Reginald and Hapford close the windows before we leave. We don't want mosquitoes when we come back. No, we certainly do not, I thought. Pudge, Ronnie, please grab another armload of wood. We'll help them, volunteered J. Michael and Daisy. We headed for the wood pile. I picked up some kindling, but Ronnie rolled over a big log. Snake! Snake! He yelled and started jumping up and down. The boys all backed away and Mr. Thriftmore came running. Oh, that is just a lizard, not a snake, he informed. It won't hurt you. Look, it has skittered up that tree. Lizards keep other unwanted things away, said AC calmly. Oh, great, declared Ronnie. Another new revelation, I wondered. Things like what? Questioned J. Michael. Evidently he wasn't too fond of lizards either. Things like spiders, AC answered. Did you see any spiders in the lodge? Now that he mentioned it, he hadn't. We supposed he had learned that last summer too. But did that mean there might be lizards inside the lodge? Lizards didn't keep the bats away, observed Hapford. Ha! Exclaimed J. Michael. lizards as well as bats. He drew his hand across his forehead as if he were about to faint. Although he hadn't seen any lizards in the lodge, probably because we had no lights, the girls in Queen Esther's lodge had. I suppose we hadn't heard the commotion over there because we were too busy with our own problems. The same person who was watching us also saw what happened at Queen Esther's lodge. He felt Miss Content handled the lizard situation very well. She had grown up in the mountains, so she simply picked up one of the creatures to show that they were harmless. Susie thought that was neat. She tried it too and decided they were wonderful pets. When she discovered they could change colour, she was really excited. And before the day was over, she had 2 or 3 lizards hanging from her jacket pockets. Eventually she found they would even hang from her ears. Even though I'm a guy, I'm not that desperate for a pet. Christy and Sandy were not jealous. They had brought their own pets. Well, I suppose you couldn't exactly call them pets, but something like that. You see, one thing that took up so much space in each duffel bag was a special friend. Snuggles was a big white floppy-eared stuffed bunny dressed in a calico dress, and Cuddles was a cuddle-sized light brown teddy bear with a big blue bow under its chin. "I'll never go on any trip without Cuddles," declared Sandy. "And Snuggles sleeps with me every night," said Christy. "She is lonely without me." None of this made sense to me, but then, I'm not a girl. Miriam didn't have any special friend, but she had some big fluffy slippers, and she would soon find out a certain creature would try to make them its home.